you recognize this actor? That's a young Burgess Meredith, starring as real-life World War II field correspondent Ernie Pyle in the 1945 biographical action film The Story of G.I. Joe. Pyle was killed in combat a mere 2 months before the movie premiered. This was my grandfather's G.I. Joe. Though heavily fictionalized, it was the story of a real man in the real war in which he really died, a war that was still going on as the film was coming out. Even the name was real. A G.I. Joe, back then, was just a generic term used to describe American GIs. This was my father's G.I. Joe, a doll. No, sorry, an action figure. In 1964, Hasbro changed the history of toy making when they made up the term action figure to see if it was possible to sell dolls to boys. It worked. My father's G.I. Joe, aka Action Man to those of you living in the UK, wasn't a real guy and he didn't fight in real wars. He was plastic, but he was built to mirror real guys. The selling point of the doll was that his uniform, gear, and accessories were close approximations of actual military equipment. He was an idealized role model, but a role model all the same. Though plastic, he was supposed to represent the virtues asked of flesh and blood soldiers heading off to fight flesh and blood wars. And this was my G.I. Joe. Yo, Joe! My generation's G.I. Joe wasn't based on real soldiers or even a real branch of the military. My G.I. Joe was a covert team of archetypal tough guys, culled not only from all corners of the army, but also from professional wrestling and ninja clans. My G.I. Joe didn't fight in real wars or against real enemies. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was on its last legs, and the rising threat of Middle Eastern terrorism didn't look as threatening as it would 2 decades later. Instead, my G.I. Joe fought Cobra, a made-up team of bad guys who had more in common with the Galactic Empire than they did anything on Earth. Made-up men in a made-up army fighting a made-up enemy. Is it any wonder that so many young men of my generation seem so confused about their place in the world as adults? Almost all of our heroes were so patently unreal. My grandfather's G.I. Joe and even my father's were made to represent something they could actually aspire to. My G.I. Joe may have taught me a lot of valuable lessons, but he also taught me that I could never really be him. There was no Cobra that needed thwarting in the real world. So what was I supposed to do? My G.I. Joe fought Cobra mainly because there was no grandly mounted existential threat like Nazism or even world communism to be fought in the real world by the 80s. Not by me, anyway. War had gone remote and then went digital. 20th century progress overall has been a positive thing socially. We're cleaner today, we're healthier, jobs are safer, and we've dismantled much of the patriarchy, the cruel and outdated social system by which old white men ruled simply by virtue of being old white men. It's a good, even great thing, in fact, that there are more women in positions of power now, and that men don't get to own their wives. The idea of masculine strength as a civilization's ultimate virtue was a cultural necessity of a bygone age when physical strength was seen as vital to power economies and fight wars. In other words, increasingly obsolete in a world of predator drones and robotic manufacturing. And that's all well and good, but if my place is no longer on the battlefield or at the controls, where is my place? For most of history, men have been defined by obligation and privilege. It's for the best that both of those have receded, but what do we replace them with? This past August, men packed theaters for The Expendables. The movie was awful, but it was promising a modern version of the same fantasy G.I. Joe did once upon a time. Heroic men bound by duty to save the day. But it was the other action film that weekend that I'd say had more relevance to the state of being a young man today, Scott Pilgrim. The hero of that film is a grown man of 22, but emotionally he might as well have been 12. And why shouldn't he be? He's a man. The world no longer expects anything of him. The worker, the white knight, the father who knows best, Scott's world no longer has much need of any of them. And yet, somehow, he still finds his place. Driven to man up in video game battles against his girlfriend's ex-boyfriends, he becomes a man and a hero, even though he doesn't need to raise a tower of steel or go to war to do it. He does it by embracing a heroism that has less to do with my grandfather's G.I. Joe, or my dad's, or even mine, and more to do with Super Mario or Mega Man. Maybe there's a generational lesson in that a man's heroes or their battles don't have to be real to be inspiring, and that a 21st century man, or woman for that matter, has to choose their own place, not because the world demands it of you, but because you demand it of yourself. And as a bonus, if we ever do find the terrorists splicing the DNA of snakes and dead conquerors to create all-powerful dictators, my generation will know how to handle that one at least. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.